Pastor Mike, good afternoon. Welcome to Mannin Line on Manx Radio. David Ashford, MHK, is on today. North Douglas MHK, Chair of Communities and Housing. And we're talking about housing today and accommodation and the lack of it, affordable housing, downsizing. Can we accommodate 10,000, 15,000 extra souls on the Isle of Man? And more to come. Pastor Mike, good afternoon, David.
Good afternoon, Andy.
Okay, let's get straight to it as well. David, how does a retiring couple downsize on the Isle of Man, says this correspondent, with no suitable stock or bungalows, 1 to 2 bedrooms to go to? With this, there will be a chance to free up our family home. It's too big, we're rattling around, it gets wasted on us. How do people downsize?
I fully agree. At the moment, it's a struggle, to be quite frank, because there isn't the bungalows and the properties available that people would want to do. I think the last time I came on the show, we spoke about this, where I said that, you know, when we talk about housing, there becomes a fascination about first-time buyers, and housing's bigger than that. And one of the things that the Housing Communities Board is focused on in responding to the housing need is also what I've started terming last-time housing. So people who might be in family homes and need to downsize. The simple fact is we need to build more stock on Ireland. We need to build more of bungalows and properties that would be attractive to people to downsize into.
This correspondent also says an ageing population, no provisioners for this as well. As a Manx through and through couple, moving away seems the only option because some of our children are across. So we may end up selling here, moving across after many generations living on the Isle of Man.
And that is why it's crucial that we actually get that balance right, that when we are actually looking at building housing stock, we don't just concentrate on the first-time buyers market, as tempting as that actually is, and the affordable housing, but actually saying what can we do to release the stock back to provide for the older age group as well. Because I know, as a constituency MHK, plenty of people that would happily downsize from their family home, but the stuff they are finding when they do, and it's few and far between, it's about the same cost as that family home. And they're saying, well, why would I downsize into something smaller that costs the same and not reap any benefit from giving up the family home? It doesn't make sense.
So, I mean, do developers factor this in, or are they obsessed with first-time buyers?
Well, developers will obviously go where they think the money is, and you know, in the schemes, that's how it works with developers. But it's important as government we are working with developers to say we need this. It may well come down to that type of housing has to have some form of subsidy attached to it to get it built, but we do need it because, as the person who's written in clearly makes the clear point, it also frees up family homes, which then makes more of a buyer's market at the other end of the scale.
Okay, you want to speak to David Ashford? By all means, call 66 13 68. We've got some messages coming in as well. Text, email, call and WhatsApp. But the OHAN, which is the Objective Assessment of Housing Need, the OHAN, says 500 new homes are going to need to be built per year.
That's right.
Between now and...
So that is if we are going to go for the high-end ambition target that's been laid out in the economic strategy. The simple fact is they're going to have to be a build, and that is a mix as well. So we've got to, again, remember, not just an obsession with first-time buyers. That requires social housing. Yeah. So, for instance, the OHAN identifies that there needs to be roughly 100 social houses built each and every year, and that's just to keep pace with where we are now.
And this is between now and 2041, is that right?
Between now and 2041.
Right.
So that would be the level of build required if we are going to look to grow the population and have adequate housing stock in the way that we're going. And there will be a response coming to Tynwald in November from me in response to the OHAN and how we are actually going to try and realise our ambitions.
I mean, it seems mixed messages. Can you forgive the public for not quite understanding? If OHAN says 500 per year between now and 2041, 800 approved, we're behind already.
We are, and that is the clear thing that is actually identified from the OHAN, that we are behind, that we actually need to get in front, particularly in relation to social and public housing. We are way behind. The stock has actually barely moved in relation to social housing. So, 2008, there was 5,286 social housing units on Ireland. 10 years ago, there was 5,520. And today, it's 5,570. So it's barely grown at all.
So is A, can the government do something about it, and B, is there the will to do something about it?
Well, this is my personal view, but my personal view is government can do something about it, because certainly public and social housing is within the remit of government. We need to work with the local authorities who also provide it, and the housing boards that provide it, to be able to grow their stock and find the most economical ways of doing that. There's a very good development going on in my constituency in Douglas North of the flats across from Williston Shops. We need to be encouraging more of that, because the problem is, if you haven't got adequate units of social housing, the people on those lists are currently probably in rented accommodation, and that then causes higher demand for rented accommodation, including higher prices, and you end up with people unable to find rented accommodation as well.
Okay, what's the relationship then between government social housing and local authority local housing? Where does the money come from or go to in that particular equation?
So without spending the entire programme explaining how the deficiency works, basically the department, the relevant department, which at the moment is DOI, acts as the regulator. So they set the overall regulation under which the boards operate, including, of course, their own housing stock. There is then the amount that comes in from the rent, and then the gap between what it actually costs to pay for and maintain and what the rental income is, that's called the deficiency, and that is met each year via the taxpayer.
So the process of building new social housing, who has to start that? Is it a local authority initiative, or is it top down or bottom up, as it were?
I think it's both. Obviously, the local authorities themselves know what their local communities need, but I think there also needs to be strategic direction from government, because if we've got to all be working together and making sure we're building stock in the right place and the right type of stock. Because, for instance, there is no point building a load of 3-bed houses or 4-bed houses if the demand is for flats. Equally, there's not a point of building a load of flats if the demand is for 3-bed houses. So we need to help the local authorities realise their visions, but alongside that, making sure that it fits in with what our assessment actually says is going to be the demand over coming years and decades.
Rent and rental properties can be an emotive issue. According to the latest inflation report, rent's up 17.3% in 12 months. Surely that's unsustainable. That means in 5 years it will have doubled.
It's completely unsustainable in my view. And I think, again, it's a symptom. It's a symptom of the fact that there is pressure on the rental stock, that for various reasons there have been landlords exiting the market. So some simply because at the moment where interest rates are, if they actually sell the property, and I've spoken to a few landlords about this, sell the property up, put the money in the bank, they're actually getting a bigger return than they are after maintenance and everything else has been taken off their rent money. So some have exited the market for that reason. And what that does as well is it actually means it's tough out there at the moment for people to find rental property. I've spoken to quite a few people who are really, really struggling in this area, and it's of great concern.
So it's down to supply and demand.
It's supply and demand, and this is what I think is driving at the moment that out of kilter inflation in rents. I mean, like I say, if you get the social housing supply right, so there is an adequate supply of social housing for those who qualify for that, that frees up the rental market, and you actually have less demand than what you're facing at the moment. You only have to walk past estate agents' windows and you can see signs up saying rental property wanted and everything else. I've spoken to a lot of people who are struggling to find at the moment.
Well, the crunch is coming. How long do you think we have then before that becomes unsustainable?
Well, my view is we need to be starting as soon as possible. We need to actually, with the response that we're going to get to Tynwald in November, we need to be working on that from day one of Tynwald's approval of it. Whatever Tynwald approves, we need to start moving, and we need to start moving now.
Vivian's with us now. Vivian, you're live with David Ashford, MHK.
Hello, David.
Hello, Vivian.
The problem is there's lots of land, there's lots of properties, and all the rest of it, but government won't release money for any organisation to build houses. I live in Ramsey now, and I'm part of the sheltered housing. We got the new building of Mayfield, but we have a blooming big property lying in Waterville Road, Coolnamary, that has to be pulled down and rebuilt. But government won't release money for us to do it. And I know they don't release money neither to the local authorities to build houses. So where are we?
Well, where we are is the system needs to change. I've been quite blunt about that. The way the deficiency, which I just briefly explained on the programme before, works, it's off the back of a Tynwald resolution that is now 25 years old. And I've made perfectly clear my view in government that funding model just does not work anymore. It is limited in its scope. It worked fine maybe for the first decade, but since then it's holding things back, and we need to have a brand new funding model, because you're quite right, there are sites, I know Douglas has got a very ambitious 10-year plan that they want to do around housing, and it's being held back for funding. Now let's not make a mistake about it, public finances at the moment are very, very tight. But if we don't invest in housing, you are not going to realise anything else. I said that when I took on this role last October, nearly a year ago now, that unless we actually start investing in housing, in bricks and mortar, in actually providing things, you won't get the young people into the island, you won't get families, you won't get the economic growth, and you won't deliver on the island plan. Everything is underpinned by housing, and that includes social housing as well. So there needs to be some way of unlocking investment for local authorities to be able to move forward with their properties, particularly the aged properties that need quite a lot of cash to unlock.
Can I tell you that I know for a fact, you know where I am, because we've had many conversations. It's a case of there are so many people on sheltered housing lists in the north. I'm not going any further than that. And also the ordinary housing, and they've been told you can do it if you've got some money, if not, leave it alone.
Well, like I say, I mean, my point of view is we need to be unlocking funding for the local authorities to be able to deal with this. In terms of sheltered housing, that fits in with what I was talking about earlier about last time housing. It's not just about private development, it's also about public development as well.
Yeah,
and ensuring, because, I mean, for 4 and a bit years, I was Minister for Health and Social Care, and I know probably better than most that if you don't have adequate levels of what I term the intermediate properties, like sheltered accommodation, then what happens is people end up in nursing homes earlier than they should.
Exactly.
And that actually ends up costing more.
Yes, I agree with everything you're saying, but I don't think a lot of people are aware of the situation.
Yeah,
I'm talking about the man in the street. He is not aware of why people aren't building anything, but it's because government are holding on to money. I know money's tight, I'm not arguing that point, but they could help to do something about it.
Yeah, and this is something that came out very clearly in the OHAN. If we are going to actually deliver on it, then we have to be involved in ensuring that we get building and we get the adequate building that we want.
Yeah.
So, I mean, from a different angle, affordable housing, if you actually look at the amount of public housing being delivered during this administration, so that's actually both social and also affordable housing, we've already equalled what was built during the duration of the entire last administration. So there are some things moving. Is it enough? No. Do I get frustrated about the level and pace of progress? Yes, I do. But this really needs to ramp up now, and that is exactly what I'll be saying to Tynwald in November.
Okay. All right, Vivian, appreciate your call.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for being with
Thanks,
us.
Vivian.
12 now. So just leaves me then, David Ashford. So whereabouts do you sit at the table? It's not a Comen position.
So it's not a Comen position. I'm not a minister. I'm not a member of Comen. What my board does is effectively a subcommittee of councillor ministers. And my role is to make sure everything is strategic, because housing in government is split across several departments. So there's elements in DHSC, there's elements in DOI, there's some elements around policy sat in Cabinet Office, which is where I sit as chair of the Housing Communities Board. And my board brings all that together, along with, of course, some lay members as well, to actually try and make sure we have one strategic direction and people aren't going off in different directions doing different things.
Here's a message in that just said, regarding, just a note on the UK, the Labour government in the UK has declared war, or effectively declared war on NIMBYs, the not in my backyard syndrome. Do you think the government here needs to start getting tough with people who object to new developments, but a reform of the planning system?
Well, as a former chair of planning, I would say planning does need to be looked at. My view in relation to planning is that the Town and Country, and this is a personal view, the Town and Country Planning Act is 25 years old this year. It's been added to with various different policies and regulations over that 25 years. I think we do need to take a deep breath, look at the planning system and see, are there particular things that are, backing up. I don't think we see the level of objection that they see sometimes in the UK, and particularly the organised level of objection they see in the UK. I don't think we see that. My experience during my time as chairman of planning is you had one or two maybe close neighbours who objected. So it is right, there is an objection process, an appeals process, but generally most developments that should have been approved, I believe, do get approved in the end.
Ballasalla, of course, is expanding enormously with that enormous estate now, which is going to effectively be doubled. Do you think that's a good thing in that it gets it out of Douglas, or do you think Douglas, Onken and Bratton will effectively get bigger and other places may not?
I think it's important we spread it around the island, that we ensure that any growth is around the island. But what's equally important, and always been important to me personally, is we need to grow services at the same time. So this has been expressed by Peel Commissioners in relation to the new houses coming up in Peel, and it's a view I've always had great sympathy with, and I've stated in Tyward many times, if government is determined to grow the population, then we have to bite the bullet and say, right, well, if we're going to do that, what do our schools look like? What does our health service look like? What does our policing look like? And actually fund the services accordingly. We have to take a gamble and invest in developing those services. Where I live up in Governor's Hill, when that estate was built, a doctor's surgery went in, the pub went in, the shops went in, there was a school went in. There was a gamble taken at that time that you'd fill those houses, you'd get the community, and that's what sometimes seems to be lacking with these developments. We're not building the services at the same time, and that's putting pressure on existing services. So I very, very much, and I've said it many times in Tynwald on a personal level, and I say it again, believe that government needs to be looking strategically and saying, if we are going to grow the population, what do the services need to look like?
I think there's several £1 million in the kitty generated from, I think, commuted sums. So does Housing and Communities have any access to those funds?
So we do. The fund, which I believe is roughly around about 8 million at the moment, it has, obviously, as all funds do, certain varies around it as to what it can be used for. But we have a separate Housing and Communities fund as well, which I think at the moment is around about 2 million. So, for instance, the OHAN, etc., was funded via there. We've been able to do some projects around homelessness via that fund as well. I believe most of the 8 million of the commuted funds, although it's sat there, it is actually committed to various things that are coming up. I believe some of the development, when it happens in Ballacobban, is committed from that fund. So although it looks a large amount, a lot of it is actually committed money over the next few years.
The mid-rent scheme, what's happening to those mid-rent scheme properties in Colby? The scheme's gone now, isn't it?
So the scheme has, it was always a time-limited scheme anyway, it was going to be reviewed.
Right.
It didn't seem to be very successful, but we are going to take another look at that.
Why wasn't it successful?
It just didn't. People just didn't seem to be able to save up the deposits necessary to be able to then move on afterwards. The feedback was there was very few who actually did what it's supposed to do, which is allow people the chance to transition. So I think what we need to do is assess and see were there particular circumstances of the way the scheme was done that prevented people being able to do that, and work out the nuancing, because mid-rent schemes do seem to work in other jurisdictions. There certainly seems to, if you look around the world, there are some great success stories. So we need to work out why the limited scheme we did, and it was very limited, didn't seem to work here. And is there anything we could do that if we did a mid-rent scheme again, we could do differently to make it work?
So has the government got any methods whereby young people, let's go to first-time buyers initially now, that we can say, in words of one syllable, this is what, because years ago the government mortgage scheme was very open and it was very obvious what needed to be done. Nowadays it seems complicated.
Well, I think what it is it's working out that different people are in different situations.
Right.
So if you're at home living with parents, it's much easier to save up a deposit than it is, obviously, if you're out in the private sector paying rent each month. So I think now there is a recognition that it's not one blunt tool. You've got to actually have different schemes and different provision. So things like, for instance, rent to buy, mid-rent, we've just spoken about, traditional first-time buyer schemes like we've got with the Home First and Home Choice. You need a scheme really for key workers as well. Because if you're going to try and encourage key workers in, you don't want them coming in and then finding they haven't got anywhere to live. And if you're doing that, they need to be able to bring their families as well. So it's not as simple as it sometimes first says, where you just do a government mortgage. Because people have still got to be able to afford that mortgage and pay it back. So there's different aspects to be looked at. But we need to put everything on the table and see what's actually, what we can actually do.
You've always been a busy constituency, MHK. What do you say when parents of young children, of young people, or they themselves come and say, how do I do this, Mr. Ashford? I'm stuck in rental property. I'm throwing good money after bad. Is there a way I can get through this?
So normally I will sit down with them and we'll actually take a look at the different schemes. Sometimes there's things that they haven't thought of, or ways they can actually save maybe a bit more that would get them over, or they do qualify for one of the schemes, but they're not too certain of how to go about it. And sometimes I'll be perfectly honest, I haven't been able to provide the help that as a constituency MHK you want to be able to do. I mean, because it's just not there.
Do people still have the stomach? Young people still have the stomach for doing without and saving?
They do. I mean, I know there's always this sort of myth that emerges that, they're all into technology now. It's not the same as, say, 20, 30 years ago where we scraped by and, we just literally had nothing and just saved. I speak to people across the generations, and the young people today, they want, those that want their own home, because it is important to emphasise not all do. There is some who are quite happy renting. And we should never make that mistake of thinking everyone wants to own their own home. But those that do, they some of the savings some young people have been able to scrape together as a percentage of earnings has been quite impressive that I've seen. So yeah, it's certainly not sometimes like the myth where they say that young people just fritter it all away or so on. That's not what I'm seeing at all.
Okay, Howard, you're live with David Ashford, MHK.
Good afternoon, Andy. Good afternoon, David.
Good afternoon, Howard.
Just a curio. I know you're you're not a minister, MHK now, but you were with Douglas Corporation for many years, doing a good job. But one of the questions in the tenants' agreements on the council houses, there's a long list of jobs that the council do not do anymore, and one of them is window replacement. Now, these windows, as you know, I live up at Anaco, and these windows are all double glazed. But I was talking last week before, to a lady who lives in a council house, but not in, it's in Spring Valley Way, and she's got 4 of her glazing units have all failed. And the council have turned around and told her, and she's not a young person, you're going to have to replace these, it's not our responsibility. And if you look at the tenants' agreement, the list is getting longer each year for the jobs that the council will not undertake. But we have, in our house, we have a contents insurance. But the contents insurance, for obvious reasons, will not cover structural work. That is part of the property owned by the landlord. But why is it that they will not replace double glazed units if they get broken? If they get broken by the tenant, it's a different story. But if they fail or are broken by an outside party, it's nothing to do with the tenant, but they need security.
Yeah, so in relation to the tenancy agreement, if it's the clause I'm thinking about, I had this with several constituents because, of course, I've got Williston in my constituency. Mm-hmm. And when we looked into it, I think it's just a bit of bad phrasing. So it's not saying they won't do it as a landlord, because as you rightly say, if something happened to the window, that's structural rather than actually contents. So tenants aren't insured. What I think that clause, if it's the one I'm thinking of, is actually saying is in the event that there's damage by the tenant or so on. But it's the way it's phrased, it reads as if that under no circumstances would the council do that. In relation to the blown panes, the simple fact is, from speaking to the council about this previously, it literally comes down to what me and Andy were discussing at the start, which is budget. They haven't got the budget there. And one of the things I've been arguing for a while is in relation to the money that the local authorities and housing boards are able to maintain for maintenance. It's a pure percentage of the rent. It doesn't take into account things like age of the property stock. So if, like Douglas, you've got an older property stock across the board, your maintenance costs are going to be higher. And there's no factoring in of that. That is something, personally, I believe we do need to start factoring in, because housing authorities with newer stock obviously have lower maintenance costs, and it does, I believe, in Douglas's case, come down to pure monetary issues. That if they start replacing the the blown panes, then basically they'll have to stop doing maintenance elsewhere.
Well, that's futile, because this lady's got 4 panes, and I don't know what size they are. There's only she was telling me, and she's not a young lady, shall we say. And she can ill afford to replace these, but she's been told we're not going to do it because we don't replace them now. That's down to yourself. And that seems to be the high-handed attitude of the council. I know we've had all 4 seals on ours, and I had to do them myself. And the water, the ingress into the house, was going to damage our property. And I had to get out and reseal the windows myself. The council said, it's going to take 3 months at least. Well, we couldn't afford to have water coming in for 3 months. And, it's somewhere in the system. They don't seem to be particularly bothered.
Yeah, I think, like I say, I'm sorry to hear that, Howard, for a start, because, like I say, I would hope that the council would be interested, particularly if there's water ingress that's going to damage the property. Certainly I can say from ones I've raised previously where there's been severe water ingress, they have actually done something about it. But like I say, from the council's point of view, I think at the moment it's about trying to spend the maintenance budget that is exceptionally finite in the best way that they can to ensure general maintenance keeps going. But certainly, if this particular lady, if she's in a Douglas house and there's an issue, I'm more than happy if she gets in touch with me to speak to the council and actually see what we can sort out. But I do know with the blown panes in the past, it has purely come down to the fact of the maintenance budget. And if they prioritise those where there isn't water getting into the property as a result, where they're just general blows, then basically that means they're not spending maintenance on other things.
Okay, all right. Thanks, Howard.
Well, thanks, David. Thanks, Andy.
Good to hear from you. Lots to get through, including this one. Talking of old favourites, should the social housing be means tested? There are some very wealthy business owners living in social housing. They've got businesses. Their businesses are thriving, and they're now paying low rent. Now, obviously, we should say that this may be just a question of success. You may have 2 parents who've got 2 children, and suddenly they all do well.
Well, for the person who's written that in, I'm delighted to say social housing is means tested. There is a good majority now of tenants are on the 5-year contracts. So social housing is obviously means tested at the point you go in. The bit that used to be missing was once you were in, there was no further means test. There is now, tenancies are for 5 years, and there is a sliding scale of income. If you reach the top of that income, then actually the local authority can remove you. But at the other scales, your rent goes up. So if you are on the very top scale, you're actually paying market rent if you stay in that social house. Okay. So there is already means testing now in place.
Could you ask David Ashford, what about the volume of empty houses around where we live? There must be about 20 empty houses, all of which used to be used for families. This is in Douglas. I'd love to downsize, but not to a bungalow out of town. I'd like a smaller townhouse in Douglas near to bus routes.
So obviously I'm not aware of where the person actually lives. They don't say that. If it's where I think it is, which they might be talking around Marathon Drive, that sort of area, I know there's been particular problems with rising damp in those properties. And again, this comes down to funding because it is going to take a lot of money to turn those properties round. There is obviously from time to time vacant properties in Williston because they've got the refurbs going on. So there's property vacant, ready to refurb, and also vacancy which are kept vacant for people to move into while their properties are refurbed. But they are generally the most of the vacancies. The vacancy rate, I believe, across all of social housing stock on the island is where you would expect it to be, which is roughly around about 2%, 2.5%.
Okay, you mentioned that housing is across ministries and departments, DESC, DHA, obviously DOI is involved as well, and Cabinet Office. So who's carrying the flag? I mean, do you carry the flag for housing and everybody looks to you, or do people from DOI or DESC get involved?
Well, I would say politically in the firing line, it's me. Obviously, the Minister for Infrastructure and the Minister for Health and Social Care also sit on the Housing and Communities Board with me. So that's what I mean about it all being joined up. It's not just an officer group or anything like that. We've got the politicians there as well. But ultimately, my role and responsibility is to try and drive forward housing policy. And as I've said, I've been quite vocal about it. We need to actually, in the next few years of this administration, start actually building things that people can actually see, feel and touch.
How many houses do you think need to be built?
Well, the OHAN is absolutely clear. I mean, you've quoted the figure there at the start. If we're going to go for the high-end ambition, which is the one you've quoted, it's the 500. But like I say, even in terms of when we just focus on social or public housing, the OHAN is saying just to keep on track, you need about 100 units a year. So we need to actually be looking at how we deliver that.
Here's a note in from Len, who just said, and again, we've mentioned this in the past, should we now be building up to better utilise the sites available? 6 or 10-storey buildings, nothing too high to upset the planners, just more units per acre. In that way you would keep land, but you could use the land that you have better by building kind of high rise. But
there is an option for that, but I think also what you've got to do is you've got to factor in what type of housing do you need, because it's all well and good going out and building, say, a 10-storey building filled with 100 or 200 flats, but if that's not where the demand is, if the demand is for family houses with garden space, then basically you've not delivered where your demand is, and you've put pressure on other areas of the housing market. So that is an option where you want to deliver, quick, high-value flats.
Yeah.
But it's not so much an option if you're going to deliver family homes. But one thing that does feed into Len's thing that we need to do is unlock some of these brownfield sites, such as the Park Road site, such as Victoria Road, and stop going round the same circles time and time again. Those sites have been vacant for so long. There needs to be some form of development. Okay,
this brings me on to Wendy. You're talking about brownfield sites. So is the government actually listening to housing needs of the population? The Westmoreland Road development's looking at small flats with no private outdoor space and no parking. The Island Infrastructure Scheme is supporting rich developers, basically, to build high-end flats which could be used as second homes or post boxes or post office boxes and never actually home residents. So why is taxpayers' money being used to fund the project in which don't appear to be actually addressing the objective housing needs of the population? Well, Mr. Johnson addressed the money comes in at the end rather than during the project. But the principle on Westmoreland Road has no outdoor spaces.
Well, if you actually look at the full overall design, there is going to be community spaces built into that.
The second part of the development.
The second part of the development in the phase 2. But also, if you actually look at what's being delivered, some of it is going to be key worker accommodation potentially as well, which is much needed. There is demand for townhouses in the centre of Douglas. You see that, and you see how quickly those fly off estate agents' windows. There is that demand there. In terms of the other development, which Mr. Johnson the Minister did actually address, equally I would say there is demand in the high-end market as well. If you speak again to some estate agents, which I've done, the high-end market actually seems to be flowing fairly decently. But what's important is we get that broad range, and there are some sites where the only thing you will put on it is probably flats that otherwise would not get developed if there wasn't some form of support.
Are you happy with what Manx Development Corporation's doing?
So I'd like to see things moving a bit faster, to be perfectly frank.
Well, Mr. Peach said he'd like to see more land released.
Yeah, well, I think that's the thing. Government has got land, actually in their remit, within their portfolio that they should be releasing. And I think I'd like to see more schemes. For me, the Manx Development Corporation's become quite involved in the building work. The way I always sort of envisaged Manx Development Corporation was as the oversight and then potentially partnering up with developers to be able to deliver the physical sites. And maybe that's what's slowing things down. But certainly, as far as I'm concerned, they are getting on with the nurses' home. But like I say, I'd like to see things move a bit faster.
David Ashford, MHK, is on Mannin Line today, talking about housing and communities. He's responsible for that. If you got any thoughts, text, email, call and WhatsApp.
We're cooking with sunshine, cholera. We're washing with sunshine, cholera. We're heating with sunshine, cholera. The future looks good. Call 676-544. Call 676-544. Call 676-544. Future looks good. 676-544.
I've just called the Guernsey Bank, Skipton International, about our savings.
And did you get a helpful robot?
No, at Skipton International you speak to a very helpful real person.
That's refreshing these days.
Well, that's why I chose them, for the perfect combination of personal customer service and some of the best savings rates. All by calling 01481 730 730 or visit skiptoninternational.com.
Skipton International is licensed to take deposits by the Guernsey Financial Services Commission and is a participant in the Guernsey Banking Deposit Compensation Scheme. Details at dcs.gg. Terms and conditions apply.
Lost in Music is coming to Villa Marina. The original disco show will take you on an electrifying journey through the sensational 70s, featuring a world-class band and dazzling vocals that will transport you straight to the heart of disco fever. Get ready to relive timeless hits from icons like Donna Summer, Gloria Gaynor, Earth, Wind and Fire, Sister Sledge and Chic, losing yourself in the music and leaving your worries behind. Don't miss out on the feel-good show of the year coming to Villa Marina on Saturday the 5th of October. Book online at villagaiety.com, call 600 555 or in person at the Villa Marina or the Welcome Centre.
Coming up, we have another winning weekend here on Manx Radio. And this time, we're giving you the chance to win £200 to spend at 1886 Bar and Cocktail Lounge, courtesy of Tell Skips. All you have to do is listen out for the winning question, which we'll ask on air right across the weekend. And once you've heard it, text your answer to 166 177. So whether you're tackling a major construction project or just doing a bit of home decluttering, Tells is the go-to company for skips for both commercial and domestic use. Make this your winning weekend with Tell Skips and your nation station, Manx Radio.
The Mannin Line with Andy Wint.
David Ashford, MHK, is with us. And Stephen, you're live with David Ashford.
Good afternoon, listeners, and good afternoon, David, and good afternoon, Andy.
Afternoon, Stephen.
I could ask a couple of points. The first one is it accurate that for a couple on minimum wage would exceed the qualification for a council property?
It depends how you calculate minimum wage, because the calculation people say is if you had two people jointly as a couple both earning minimum wage, then yes, they would. If you have, but of course, the way minimum wage works is it also works, it works on affordability ratio. So a couple wouldn't be seen as needing to earn as much as two full minimum wages. But yes, it does. And my view is the thresholds need to be looked at.
Well, firstly, I would say, what are you going to do about that? What's your plan to solve that problem first? Have you anything in your ideas to go to Treasury, go to DRI, go to Timwell to address that one problem firstly?
Yes, so so basically all the thresholds are already under review, and there will obviously be in due time be consideration made of Timwell of whatever comes back out of that review. But my personal opinion in relation to that is the thresholds at the moment are too low.
Well, I do hope you make some progress with Treasury to solve that problem. Second point is, have you any budget from Treasury to build, let's simply build some council housing, not affordable housing, because I think that terminology is open for great interpretation between those that may want to buy a house, not rent a house. So Is there going to be a budget from Treasury to build social stroke council housing?
Well, one of the things we're doing at the moment, of course, is developing the Housing Association, and part of the Housing Association's remit will be to actually try and develop and expand the social housing stock, and that will require government investment. So while currently there is no budget in place, as I say, I've got the response to the OHAN going to November's Timwood, where I'll be laying out more around the direction of travel. But if government is going to be serious about delivering its economic strategy and its growth in population, then there needs to be upfront investment, particularly in social housing and ensuring that we've got an adequate stock.
The third and final point I'd like your comments on is not just the MDC, which is a building company, and I've grave reservations about why a government should own a building company. I think this is an example of we're trying to do too much at government. Government should really concentrate on core services and let the private sector do what the private sector does. So we come to the next point, is where people decide on an estate, such as, let's use the Peel estate. There's just the recent one that's got planning approval. And yet all the objections have not been against the actual housing development as such. They have been against the lack of provision of infrastructure. Should a greater emphasis be done by town planners to ensure that rather than just having uncontrolled development of dwellings, there should be a requirement for a town planner to look at what is required in that area? We all know about the problems of even simple things such as dentistry and seeing healthcare professionals in all areas of the island. So my question to you is, would you support town planners having a greater emphasis on planning requirements?
Quickest answer of the day, Stephen, yes. As I spoke with Andy earlier in the programme around the fact we need to grow services at the same time as you grow. For me, it is crazy to build a load of developments without actually looking at what the impact on the services is. There doesn't ever seem to be any impact assessment in terms of doctors, GPs, doctors, healthcare, schools, infrastructure, roads. All that should actually form part of it as well. And again, if government's going to grow the population, my personal view is you need to grow the services alongside. You can't do the population first and put the pressure on existing services. You need to be doing the two in tandem, and that does cost money, and we have to accept that.
Well, my final comment is I think you're going to go into a general election with achieving not a lot of the objectives you want to achieve, sadly.
Well, like I say, for me, the next 2 years, and I've said this publicly many, many times, and I'll say it again, in terms of housing, has got to be around delivery. There's been a lot of data collection, there's been a lot of work done in the background, but the next 2 years has to be all about bringing forward things that people can see, feel, touch, and in terms of housing, live in.
Okay, all right, Stephen, thanks for calling.
Thank you.
Good to hear from you. Just regarding Stephen, every point he makes is, as you say, about infrastructure. And you mentioned Governor Silt. The Cat with No Tail has been a success from start to finish.
It has. It's a wonderful community pub up there.
And interesting that if you build communities and you put a shop and a health centre, and if you put a chemist there as well, if you put a pub there, it becomes a community.
Yeah, it's proper strategic planning, it's community planning. And like I say, I think as we go forward, if we are going to meet the population targets that government is talking about, and we are going to deliver on the economic strategy, then those are the sort of things you need to do. Because worrying about it afterwards normally means there isn't enough land to build those kind of things.
What's your opinion of that future, the Braddon, the plan scheme for Braddon?
Well, I was chair of planning at the time, and I was the member of the planning committee that actually voted against it, coming off Braddon Road there. My main concern was about the fact it was, certainly at the beginning, a single entry point. And I did worry about the traffic flows in and out. So that was my view when it came through planning.
We should, a correspondent, this is 352, says, speculate to accumulate. The government should speculate on this. They should actually put their money where their mouth is.
And I can't disagree with the person. I've been clear all along that if we are going to deliver this, we're not going to be able to do it on thin air. It will require investment from government. It will require upfront investment from the public purse to be able to drive things forward.
And again, the public hears Mr. Cannon's aims, the extra population, getting the economy moving, the whole thing. But it just, everything at the moment is waiting for something to happen.
Yeah, and I think what we need to do, like I say, is get some housing projects off the ground so people can actually see that things are physically happening, that there's actually something there. And that is the key to unlocking everything. Because as I say, housing, for me, underpins everything. You won't deliver your economic strategy, you won't deliver your population strategy unless you start delivering the housing that the people need.
John on 557 dropped a note in. David Ashford is correct. Many landlords are leaving. I've just witnessed a terrible state that tenants left a property in, selling and money in the bank without the constant stress or maintenance and repairs and the new landlord's bill.
I mean, the new landlord's bill, I think, because it's taken so long for the regulations to come forward, which we're 4 years on from the bill now. I think it was 2021 we put the bill through. Or 2020 even, that basically people, I think, are suspicious about what's going to come forward in that regulation. I believe the regulation is pretty much ready now, so there'll be some there'll have to be a public consultation around that. But obviously the length of time it's taken, it's allowed people to speculate what might or might not be in there. And it is important, in my view, that any regulation is fair, applies equally, and also recognises the fact that actually it's not just about landlords. You can have disruptive tenants as well. You can have very good landlords with disruptive tenants, and it needs to be a balance.
Okay. Do you have any opinions, or does the government have any opinion on the landlords, and we know who they are, who own dozens and dozens and dozens of properties?
Well, in what terms of an opinion, Andy?
As in, is that good for the economy, or is it some people who are basically running a large business, renting properties out that they've accumulated?
Well, I always have a personal view, and I know some large landlords that are very, very good landlords, that look after their tenants well. They provide a large amount of stock for some of the most vulnerable people in our society. Equally, having been a constituency MHK and also a Douglas councillor before that, I know some landlords that, should we say diplomatically, I don't think things do come up to scratch. I don't think they are providing necessarily a good provision for their tenants, and that is why it is important we do have some form of regulation in the market to ensure the tenants are protected. But equally, like I say, it's important that anything that comes forward does recognise that there needs to be some protection of landlords as well.
Okay, we're running out of time now. What does, when developers talk about affordable housing, this is Kat who says, when they say they provide affordable housing, what does affordable housing mean?
So this is a big debate that's been had in the UK, because in the UK there's been cases of saying, oh, we're delivering affordable housing, and the units are about £300,000, 350,000. For me, affordable housing is very, very simple, which basically means that what is your build cost and a small margin on top. That for me is affordable housing. That is the definition for me, ensuring that people can actually, at the lower end, if they wanted to save and you're on average wage, you'd be able to do so and then be able to access that market.
Okay, I was just looking at the definition of affordable housing, and apparently it says affordable housing is what's deemed affordable to those with a household income at or below the median wage as rated by the national government or a local government by a recognised housing affordability. Housing Association on the Isle of Man.
Yes, so the Housing Association is in development. We had the agreement from Tynwald to proceed with the particular option that was chosen, and we hopefully will be coming back with some more on that in April next year.
Okay, this verges on being quite personal, and it's from a lady called Ursula, and she says, David Ashford always sounds so amenable and so friendly. Does he ever get nasty inside politics and in private?
No, I don't do things personally in politics, to be perfectly frank.
You have to bang the table sometimes.
You have to bang it. You have to be firm. And if people listen to me speak in Tynwald, they're left in no doubt about what my views are. But I don't believe in being nasty to people. I don't believe in, dealing with personalities. I don't think actually in the end of the day that actually gets you anywhere. I don't think it gets you anywhere in politics. I don't think it gets you anywhere in life. You can make your point without having to be nasty to people.
Okay, who pays for the repairs after the refurbishment of Williston houses now? I mean, how much money have they used from that?
So in terms of that works back to where we talked about earlier, which is the deficiency. So the overall amount of the refurbishment goes on top of what would be technically termed the housing tab. And then the amount comes in by rents. And then any gap between that each year is actually then paid for by the taxpayer.
Okay, thanks for being with us today. We appreciate it.
Thank you as always, Andy.
And maybe we'll try and get a couple of people in from Douglas Council and chat about housing in Douglas. I'm trying to... When was Paul Rose replaced? That was 10, 15 years ago?
You're testing my memory. I was a young councillor with hair then. So you're probably talking 2007, 2008, I think.
All right, thanks for being with us today. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Andy.
We're open line tomorrow on Wednesday, open line on Thursday. The Chief Minister is here on Friday, Alfred Cannon, MHK. That's it. Stick around. Thanks to Chris Quirk on the phones.
Andy Wynn.
When I decided to get a motorised chair to help my wife, we went straight to Millichaps. Why? Because we were impressed by their superb range. And, of course, a comfortable chair is something you really need to try before you buy. We spent plenty of time to decide what was right for us, and the friendly expert staff at Millichaps